May 13, 1985 started like any other spring morning in West Philadelphia. Children were getting ready for school. Parents were rushing through breakfast. Some people were already leaving for work, coffee cups in hand, expecting nothing more dramatic than traffic and deadlines. No one imagined that by the end of that day, their neighborhood would look like a war zone. Around 5:30 a.m., residents of Osage Avenue were awakened by a sound that didn't belong in a quiet American neighborhood: heavy boots hitting pavement, police radios crackling, engines idling. When people pulled back their curtains, what they saw made their stomachs drop. Police were everywhere, not just a few patrol cars. Hundreds of officers had surrounded the block, some carried rifles. Others wore helmets. There were tactical units, armored vehicles, and firefighters staged nearby, as if preparing for a disaster that hadn't happened yet. To the families living there, it felt less like policing and more like a military operation. But the target was not a foreign enemy, it was a house. Inside that house lived members of a group called MOVE, a controversial back-to-nature organization known for its radical beliefs, confrontations with authorities, and refusal to follow many conventional rules of society. For years, tensions between MOVE and the city had been building. Neighbors had complained about loudspeaker announcements that blasted political messages day and night. There had been disputes about sanitation, property conditions, and prior arrests. Officials believed the situation had become intolerable, so the city made a decision: they would end it. That morning, police arrived with arrest warrants for several MOVE members on charges that included disorderly conduct and weapons violations. The plan, at least on paper, sounded controlled. Serve the warrants, evict the occupants, clear the property, restore order, but plans written in offices rarely survive contact with reality. At around 6:00 a.m., Police Commissioner Gregor Samber stepped forward with a bullhorn. His voice echoed through the street. "This is America," he reportedly announced. "You have to abide by the laws of the United States." He ordered everyone inside the house to come out peacefully. No one moved. Minutes passed, then more warnings, still nothing. What police didn't fully know, but strongly suspected, was that MOVE members were prepared for confrontation. The house had been fortified. A bunker-like structure had been built on the roof. And inside were not only adults, there were children too. That fact alone should have slowed everything down, but by then the operation had its own momentum. Nearly 500 officers were already committed. Backups were in place. Media was gathering. Backing away would look like weakness, so the pressure increased. Police attempted to force people out using tear gas. Canisters were fired. Smoke drifted across the block. Neighbors watched from windows, some clutching their phones, others holding their children close, unsure whether to stay or run. Then gunfire erupted. To this day, debate continues over exactly who fired first. What is certain is that once the shooting started, it did not stop quickly. Bullets tore through the early morning quiet. Officers took cover behind vehicles. Residents dropped to their floors. Parents threw themselves over their kids. For many families, confusion quickly turned into fear. This was not how law enforcement was supposed to look in their neighborhood. Hours went by. The standoff dragged into late morning. Police pumped thousands of rounds toward the MOVE house. Water cannons were deployed in an attempt to destroy the rooftop bunker. Still, the structure held. Still, the people inside did not surrender. By midday, frustration was spreading through command ranks. Nothing was working. And when authorities feel they are losing control, decisions can become dangerous. Inside command vehicles, leaders began discussing options that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. One question hovered in the air: how far are we willing to go to end this? Meanwhile, the rest of the neighborhood had effectively become collateral. Families were being evacuated in chaos, some left with nothing but the clothes they were wearing. Pets were abandoned in the rush, doors hung open. Garden hoses still ran across lawns. It looked like a storm had passed through, except the storm was human. Yet even with civilians fleeing, the operation escalated. Police requested something rarely associated with urban law enforcement: explosives, not metaphorical pressure, actual explosives. The justification centered on that rooftop bunker. Officials argued it gave MOVE members a tactical advantage and posed a threat to officers. Destroy the bunker, they believed, and the confrontation would finally end. But there is a moment before every irreversible decision, a quiet space where someone could still say, "Stop." That moment came and went. By late afternoon, a state police helicopter rose into the sky above Osage Avenue. Imagine being a resident watching that aircraft circle overhead. Helicopters belonged in war footage, not above American row houses. Below, the block sat tense and half-empty. Some neighbors had gathered at a distance, held back by barricades, watching events unfold with growing dread. Then it happened. From that helicopter, authorities dropped a small satchel containing an explosive, a combination reportedly including Tovex, a commercial blasting agent. It landed on the roof. For a second, nothing. Then a blast, the bunker was destroyed, but the explosion did something else too. It ignited a fire. At first, flames seemed manageable, the kind firefighters extinguish every day. But what happened next would define the tragedy. Instead of immediately attacking the fire, officials made a decision that still shocks historians and investigators decades later. They let it burn. The reasoning, according to later testimony, was tactical. Command believed the fire might force move members out of the building, put it out too quickly, and the standoff might continue. So firefighters were told to hold back. Think about that. A fire had started in a densely packed residential neighborhood filled with connected row homes, structures famous for allowing flames to spread rapidly, and the order was to wait. Fire does not negotiate. Within minutes, flames climbed higher, heat shattered windows, thick black smoke poured into the sky, visible for miles. The sound changed too, from crackling to roaring. Neighbors watching from afar began to panic. Some reportedly screamed at officials to put the fire out, others simply cried. Because anyone who has ever seen a house fire knows one terrifying truth: once it grows beyond a certain point, control disappears. Inside the move house were children. That fact now pressed heavily on the unfolding disaster, but the window for easy intervention was closing fast. The blaze jumped from roof to roof, row house to row house. Like dominoes made of wood and brick, soon it was no longer just one building, it was the block. Firefighters were finally allowed to act, but by then, nature was in charge. Hoses sprayed water into an inferno already consuming homes. Explosions popped as household items ignited, cars melted, trees blackened. Families who had fled earlier could only watch as everything they owned vanished. Photographs, birth certificates, wedding albums, childhood drawings taped to refrigerators. Entire lives reduced to smoke, and still the question hung over the scene: how did it go this far? By nightfall, the fire had destroyed more than 60 homes. An entire neighborhood was erased in a matter of hours, but the most heartbreaking truth was yet to emerge. Because as the flames died down and the ruins cooled, investigators began to understand something devastating. Not everyone had made it out. And the number of lives lost would force the nation to confront a question almost too uncomfortable to ask. How could this happen, not in some distant battlefield, but in the middle of an American city? And as the ashes settled over Osage Avenue, another realization slowly took hold. This was no longer just a police operation gone wrong. It was a moment that would challenge the very idea of what government power is supposed to protect. What investigators would soon uncover inside that burned-out shell would shock even those who believed they had already seen the worst. What investigators uncovered in the ruins the next morning did more than shock the city. It shattered any remaining illusion that the disaster had been controlled. The smoke had thinned, but the smell lingered. A heavy, bitter odor of burned wood, melted plastic, and something far more haunting, the unmistakable scent of lives interrupted. Ash drifted through the air like gray snow. Firefighters stepped carefully across the wreckage, their boots sinking into debris that was still warm in places. Entire rows of houses were gone, replaced by blackened foundations and skeletal beams pointing toward the sky. For the families who returned, the silence was unbearable. Where children once played, there was nothing: no laughter, no front doors, no street signs, just destruction. Many residents stood frozen, unable to process what their eyes were telling them. Some covered their mouths, others simply stared. One woman reportedly kept repeating the same sentence over and over: "My house was right there, but the hardest discoveries were still ahead." Recovery teams began searching the remains of the move house, the place where the fire had started, the place where authorities had hoped the flames would force surrender. Instead, it had become a trap. Inside the wreckage, they found bodies. 11 people had died. Among them were 5 children. Think about that for a moment. Children who had woken up that morning inside a home. unaware they were about to become part of one of the darkest days in modern American history. The youngest victims were reported to be just a few years old. There are tragedies that feel accidental, and then there are tragedies that feel preventable. This one immediately raised a question that spread far beyond Philadelphia. Why was the fire allowed to burn? Officials initially defended their decisions using the language of tactical necessity. They argued the situation was volatile. They said MOVE members were armed. They insisted officers' lives were at risk. But to the public, one detail overshadowed everything else. Authorities knew children were inside. The narrative began to shift. What had first sounded like a dangerous standoff now looked increasingly like catastrophic misjudgment. News footage spread across the country. Viewers watched entire blocks reduced to ash. They saw families hugging each other in shock. They heard the death toll. And many asked the same stunned question. The police dropped a bomb. The phrase alone sounded unreal, something from a dystopian novel rather than a democratic society. Yet it was true. A city government had authorized the use of an explosive device on a residential building. The backlash was immediate. Community leaders demanded answers. Civil rights advocates called it an outrageous use of force. Even people with no connection to MOVE felt a deep unease creeping in. If this could happen here, what did it say about the limits of state power? Meanwhile, the survivors carried stories that were almost too painful to hear. One of them was a young boy who managed to escape the inferno. Burned, traumatized, and barely alive, he later described the chaos inside as flames consumed the house. Imagine the terror of that moment, smoke so thick you can't see, heat closing in from every direction, adults shouting, children crying, no clear path out. For those trapped inside, the fire was not tactical, it was apocalyptic, and outside, the neighborhood watched helplessly. Residents who had lost their homes now learned that neighbors, including children, had died just steps away from where they once slept. Grief quickly mixed with anger. Because disasters caused by nature often unite people, but disasters caused by human decisions create a different emotion. Someone must answer for this. City officials moved quickly to control the narrative. Press conferences were held, statements were crafted carefully. Words like unfortunate, necessary, and tragic appeared again and again. But critics noticed something missing: responsibility. No one stepped forward to say, this should never have happened. Instead, explanations leaned heavily on the difficulty of the situation. MOVE was described as dangerous, unpredictable, militant. And while many agreed the group had been confrontational, a deeper question refused to fade. Did any threat justify burning down an entire neighborhood? Investigations were announced. Panels were formed, commissions promised transparency. For a moment, it seemed the city might fully confront what had occurred. But history shows that accountability is rarely simple when institutions investigate themselves. As weeks passed, more details surfaced, each one sharpening public outrage. Firefighters later testified that they were ready to fight the blaze sooner. Some said they were told to stand down, to wait, to let the fire do its work. That revelation alone changed how many people understood the disaster, because it suggested the destruction was not merely an unintended consequence. It was, at least briefly, tolerated. Meanwhile, the displaced families faced a quieter nightmare. Over 250 people were suddenly homeless. Insurance battles began, temporary shelters filled. Parents struggled to explain to their children why they could never go back home. Trauma does not end when flames go out, it lingers in uncertainty. Where will we live? How do we rebuild? Who will help us? And beneath all those questions was another, heavier one. Did our own government just destroy our lives? National media dug deeper. Scholars debated the ethics. Law enforcement agencies across the country watched closely, aware that the precedent being set in Philadelphia could ripple outward. Trust, once broken, is hard to restore. Especially when the force that caused the damage was meant to protect. Then came one of the most sobering conclusions. An investigative commission would later state that the decision to drop the bomb was unconscionable. Not merely a mistake, unconscionable. The word carried enormous weight. It implied a violation not just of policy, but of moral judgment. Yet even as that language entered the historical record, a troubling reality began to emerge. Condemnation does not automatically lead to punishment, and punishment was what many citizens expected. Someone must be held accountable. Someone must answer for 11 deaths. Someone must answer for 61 destroyed homes. But as legal processes unfolded, the path toward justice grew murky. Blame dispersed across departments, orders had passed through multiple levels. Decisions had been collective, and when responsibility is shared widely enough, it can become strangely invisible. The city eventually reached financial settlements with some victims and displaced residents. Millions of dollars were paid, but money has limits. It cannot resurrect lives. It cannot erase the memory of watching your home burn while authorities stood by. For many, the settlements felt less like justice and more like quiet closure, a way to move forward without fully confronting the past. Years later, scholars would still debate the same haunting question: was this a failure of leadership or a failure of imagination? Because somewhere along the chain of command, a decision-maker looked at a residential block filled with families and believed an explosive device was an acceptable solution. Understanding that mindset became essential, not just for Philadelphia, but for anyone trying to grasp how institutions behave under pressure, how fear can narrow judgment, how urgency can overpower caution, how authority, once escalated, rarely steps backward. But perhaps the most chilling realization was this: none of the officials involved that day would serve prison time for the bombing, not one. For the families who buried loved ones, that fact cut deeper than any public apology. Justice delayed is painful, justice denied is unforgettable. And as the city struggled to rebuild physically, another challenge loomed: rebuilding trust. Because once people begin to question whether the systems designed to protect them might instead endanger them, the damage spreads far beyond a single neighborhood. Yet the story was not over. In the months that followed, America would wrestle with the meaning of what had happened on Osage Avenue. Not just how it happened, but what it revealed about power, about responsibility, about the terrifying speed at which an operation can cross the line from enforcement into catastrophe. And as more testimony emerged, one unsettling idea began to take shape. This was not a split-second mistake. It was the result of a chain of decisions, each one bringing the city closer to a point of no return. The next question investigators would confront was perhaps the hardest of all. Who made those decisions, and why did no one stop them before the sky itself seemed to fall on an American neighborhood? Who made those decisions, and why did no one stop them before the sky itself seemed to fall on an American neighborhood? That question hung over Philadelphia like a second cloud of smoke, one that would not disappear with time. In the weeks after the bombing, pressure mounted too quickly for the city to ignore. Public anger was growing. National media had begun framing the disaster not just as a local tragedy, but as a warning about unchecked authority. So the city did what governments often do after an event too large to quietly move past. It launched an official investigation. An independent body known as the Move Commission was formed to uncover the truth. Its purpose sounded simple: determine what happened, who was responsible, and how such a catastrophe could have occurred in a residential American neighborhood. But investigations of this scale rarely uncover comfortable truths. From the very beginning, testimony revealed something deeply unsettling. This disaster had not been caused by one reckless individual in a moment of panic. It had been built step by step. Decision by decision, meeting by meeting, the operation itself had been approved at the highest levels of city leadership. Philadelphia's mayor at the time, Wilson Goode, had given the final authorization to drop the explosive device. To understand the weight of that moment, picture the gravity of the choice. Somewhere inside a government office, surrounded by advisors, reports, and tactical briefings, the mayor of a major American city agreed to use a bomb on a house within his own jurisdiction. Not in war, not overseas, but at home. Supporters later argued that Goode trusted the recommendations of law enforcement experts, that he believed the plan would neutralize the rooftop bunker without causing widespread destruction. But leadership carries a burden that cannot be delegated. When you approve force, you also approve its consequences, even the ones no one predicted. As hearings continued, another detail emerged that deeply troubled investigators. Fire Commissioner William Richmond had been present during discussions about the fire risk. Officials knew the homes on Osage Avenue were tightly connected, classic row houses where flames could travel rapidly from one structure to another. The danger was not theoretical, it was obvious. Yet somehow the plan moved forward. Then came the testimony that shifted public perception even further. Firefighters revealed they had been instructed to let the fire burn after the explosion. Not forever, but long enough, officials believed, to destroy the bunker and force move members out. It was a tactical calculation, one that underestimated the oldest, most uncontrollable force known to humanity. Fire does not remain where you want it. Once investigators heard this, the narrative changed again. This was no longer just about the bomb. It was about the decision to tolerate a growing fire in a neighborhood full of homes. The commission's final report did not soften its language. The decision to drop the bomb, it concluded, was unconscionable. The word echoed across headlines, unconscionable. Not merely an error in judgment, a moral failure. Yet even as the report condemned the actions, it stopped short of recommending criminal charges against top officials. And that created a tension that many Americans found difficult to accept. If something is unconscionable, if children died, if an entire neighborhood was erased, how could no one be criminally responsible? The answer lies in a complicated reality about institutional power. Large-scale decisions often pass through so many hands that accountability becomes diluted. Each person plays a role, each assumes someone else has fully calculated the risks. By the time disaster strikes, responsibility is everywhere and nowhere. Mayor Good publicly apologized years later, expressing deep regret for what had happened. He would describe the bombing as one of the greatest tragedies of his career, but apologies, no matter how sincere, do not rewind history. For the families who lost loved ones, regret could never equal justice. Meanwhile, legal battles unfolded slowly. Some lawsuits succeeded, settlements were paid. But criminal prosecutions never materialized for the officials who authorized the bombing. There was, however, one exception, though not in the way most people expected. Ramona Africa, the lone adult survivor from inside the move house, was charged and later convicted of riot and conspiracy. She served prison time. Think about the emotional complexity of that outcome. The only adult to survive the bombing was also the only person to go to jail in connection with the events of that day. To some observers, it felt like history had twisted itself into a painful paradox. As the years passed, Osage Avenue was rebuilt. New houses replaced the ones reduced to ash. Fresh paint covered the memory of smoke. From a distance, the street began to look normal again, but normal is often an illusion. Many original residents never returned. Some couldn't bear the memories, others felt the neighborhood would always be haunted. Even the rebuilt homes carried problems, construction flaws, structural issues, maintenance disputes, as if the ground itself resisted being forgotten. Trauma has a way of embedding itself into places, into sidewalks, into walls, into the quiet spaces between houses, and then there was the national impact. Law enforcement agencies across the country studied the move bombing as a case example, not only of tactical escalation, but of catastrophic miscalculation. Training programs began emphasizing de-escalation, risk assessment, civilian safety. The event became a cautionary tale whispered through academies. This is what happens when control is lost. But beneath those professional lessons lay a deeper philosophical question. What is the boundary between authority and force? Governments are granted power to maintain order. Citizens accept that power because it is supposed to protect them. But when protection turns into destruction, the social contract trembles. Trust, once fractured, rarely heals completely. For many Americans watching from afar in 1985, the bombing forced an uncomfortable realization. The line separating democracy from devastation is thinner than we like to believe. And sometimes crossing that line does not require evil intent, only a chain of decisions made under pressure. Fear can narrow vision, urgency can silence doubt. Group consensus can overpower individual hesitation. Somewhere in that chain, someone might have felt a flicker of uncertainty, a quiet internal voice asking whether this had gone too far. But institutions move with momentum, and momentum is hard to stop. Years later, historians would still analyze the move bombing not simply as a policing failure, but as a study in escalation. How situations intensify, how language shifts from negotiation to enforcement, and from enforcement to confrontation. And how, once a plan is in motion, reversing course becomes psychologically and politically difficult. Yet perhaps the most haunting legacy of that day is not just the destruction, but the realization that it was preventable. Preventable if different choices had been made. Preventable if caution had outweighed urgency. preventable if someone, somewhere in that command structure, had insisted on another path. But history does not record the paths we never take, only the ones we do. And as America tried to absorb what had happened in Philadelphia, another question slowly surfaced, quieter, but far more enduring. What does a society owe the people it fails to protect? Because rebuilding houses is one thing, rebuilding faith is another entirely. And in the shadow of that question, the country would soon confront the final and most difficult challenge of all. How do you remember a tragedy caused not by nature, but by your own institutions? How do you remember a tragedy caused not by nature, but by your own institutions? For Philadelphia, that question never found an easy answer. Years passed, but the move bombing refused to settle quietly into the past. It lingered in conversations, in classrooms, in documentaries, and most of all, in the hearts of those who had lived through it. Because some events don't simply become history. They become warnings. In the immediate aftermath, the city focused on rebuilding. Construction crews arrived on Osage Avenue with blueprints and promises. Officials spoke about renewal, about giving families a chance to return, about restoring what had been lost. New houses rose where charred remains once stood. Fresh brick replaced blackened walls. Windows reflected sunlight instead of flame. From the outside, it looked like recovery. But rebuilding structures is far easier than rebuilding trust. Many former residents chose never to come back. Some said the memories were too heavy, that every step down the street would remind them of the day the sky filled with smoke. Others no longer believed the city could keep them safe. And safety, once doubted, is difficult to restore. Those who did return often discovered new problems waiting for them. Reports began surfacing that the reconstructed homes had serious defects, leaking roofs, faulty wiring, structural weaknesses. Imagine losing everything in a fire, finally receiving a new home, and then realizing that home itself might not be reliable. For some families, it felt like a second betrayal. The city faced lawsuits again. Repairs were ordered. Millions more dollars were spent correcting mistakes that many believed should never have happened in the first place. It was as if the consequences of that single day kept unfolding, year after year. But the most disturbing revelations were still ahead, and they would reopen wounds many thought had begun to close. Decades after the bombing, attention returned unexpectedly to the remains of the victims. For years, it was believed that the dead had been treated with the dignity such a tragedy demanded. Then came a discovery that shocked even those familiar with the darkest details of the event. In 2021, it emerged that bone fragments from one of the child victims had been kept by researchers and used in academic settings without the family's knowledge. Pause for a moment and consider the weight of that. Not only had lives been lost in a catastrophic decision, but parts of those victims had circulated quietly through educational institutions. When the news broke, outrage followed swiftly. Community leaders demanded explanations. How could this happen? How could the remains of a child be handled without consent? City officials publicly apologized. Institutions involved acknowledged profound failures in judgment. The remains were finally returned for proper burial. But apologies, once again, arrived long after the damage was done. For many Philadelphians, the revelation reinforced a painful belief that the victims of MOVE had not been treated with the humanity they deserved, not in death, and perhaps not even in memory. Yet even as controversy resurfaced, the bombing had already secured its place as one of the most studied disasters in modern American urban history. Police academies examined it. Ethics courses debated it. Leadership programs analyzed it, not because it was ordinary, but because it was extraordinary in the most troubling way. It forced professionals across the country to confront uncomfortable questions. How much force is too much? When does authority become escalation? At what point does maintaining order begin to destroy the very community it is meant to protect? The MOVE bombing became a case study in what experts now call mission creep, the gradual expansion of an operation beyond its original goals. Serve arrest warrants, then control the standoff. Then neutralize the bunker, then use explosives, then tolerate the fire. Each step may have seemed logical in isolation. Together, they formed a chain reaction. And like many chain reactions, once it started, stopping it became almost impossible. Historians often note that disasters rarely come from a single terrible decision. More often, they emerge from many smaller choices, each one narrowing the path until only catastrophe remains. The tragedy on Osage Avenue followed that pattern with chilling precision. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of that day is not tactical, it is psychological, because events like the MOVE bombing reshape how citizens see power. Before 1985, many Americans believed such scenes belonged elsewhere in unstable regions, under authoritarian regimes, far removed from their daily reality. Philadelphia shattered that illusion. It showed that even within a democracy, the machinery of government can produce outcomes no one imagined possible, not through malice alone, but through fear, through pressure. Through the human tendency to believe we are still in control, even when events are slipping beyond our grasp. For the children who grew up hearing about the bombing, it became part of local identity, a story passed down with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. You know, they dropped a bomb here once, some would say, and newcomers hearing it for the first time often reacted the same way. Wait, here, in America, yes, here. That realization continues to echo because it challenges a comforting assumption that certain lines simply will not be crossed. History teaches otherwise. Sometimes the most important legacy of a tragedy is the lesson it leaves behind. In the years since, policing strategies across the United States have increasingly emphasized de-escalation, negotiation, and crisis management. While no reform can undo the past, many experts believe the MOVE bombing helped accelerate a national conversation about restraint, a painful catalyst for change. Yet for the families who lost loved ones, the word lesson can feel inadequate. Lessons are abstract, their loss was not. They remember birthdays that never came, voices they will never hear again. Ordinary moments permanently erased, and so memory becomes its own form of justice, imperfect but powerful. Every time the story is told, it resists disappearance. Every retelling pushes back against the silence that so often follows institutional failure, because forgetting would be the final tragedy. Today, if you walk down Osage Avenue, you might see neat rows of homes, trimmed lawns, children riding bikes. At first glance, nothing suggests the ground once burned. But history does not vanish just because it is no longer visible. It lives beneath the surface, in the awareness of what happened, in the caution it inspires. In the quiet hope that such a decision will never be repeated, the MOVE bombing left behind more than rubble. It left behind a question that every generation must answer for itself. What are the limits of power, and who decides when they have been crossed? Because a government's greatest strength is not the force it can deploy, it is the trust its people place in it. Lose that trust, and even the strongest institutions begin to fracture. And perhaps that is the final meaning of what happened on that spring day in 1985. Not simply that a bomb was dropped, not simply that homes were destroyed, but that the event revealed how fragile the boundary is between protection and harm. A boundary that must be guarded not just by leaders, but by the vigilance of everyone. Because history has already shown what can happen when that line disappears, and remembering it may be the only way to ensure it never does again.